Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Bellatrix Lestrange is one of the most terrifying yet incredibly fascinating figures in the Harry Potter universe. She is often seen in a one-dimensional way based on superficial impressions from the films. However, behind this dark persona lies something far more complex. Today, we will debunk the most common myths about Bellatrix and discover what's true and what's pure fiction. Enjoy the video. Number 1. She wasn't crazy. Bellatrix is often labeled as insane. And to be fair, her reputation fuels this idea. But beneath her eccentric appearance lies a cold, calculated purpose. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it with intent. When Voldemort made her one of his most trusted allies, he knew he could rely on her. Bellatrix embraced his ideology to the last drop of blood, willingly participating in his cruelest plans, without hesitation, without remorse. Number 2, she was a master duelist. Many Death Eaters are depicted as intimidating in appearance, but clumsy in battle, like magical stormtroopers. But Bellatrix was an exception. Her combat skills were truly remarkable. The films leave much out, but in the books she fought simultaneously against Hermione, Ginny, and Luna, and held her own. Not only did she stay calm in battle, but she could fight multiple powerful opponents at once. Number 3, she wasn't beautiful. Bellatrix, portrayed by Helena Bonham Carter in the films, is charismatic, even attractive in her wild appearance. But the Bellatrix from the books is very different. After 15 years in Azkaban, her face became withered, her features sharp and menacing. Imprisonment and constant exposure to Dementors left their mark. She had once been a woman of noble birth, accustomed to luxury, but now she embodied fear, not just in her nature, but in her very appearance. Number 4, she had a daughter. Those familiar only with the original books or films may not know that Bellatrix had a daughter, and her father wasn't Rodolphus Lestrange, but Lord Voldemort himself. In the play Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, it's revealed that between the events of Order of the Phoenix and the end of Half-Blood Prince, Bellatrix gave birth to a girl named Delphi, the result of her total devotion to Voldemort. Number 5, she was one of the few women among the Death Eaters. At first glance, it might seem that there were many women among the Death Eaters, but that's not the case. In the canon, only 2 women officially held this title, Bellatrix and Alecto Caro. Even her sister Narcissa wasn't an official member. Bellatrix had to fight her way through a world dominated by male control and violence, proving her strength and loyalty far more ruthlessly than most. Number 6, Voldemort was her only attachment. Yes, her feelings for Voldemort were unquestionable, but that doesn't mean she was incapable of forming other attachments. One surprising example is the house elf Kreacher. Bellatrix showed him kindness, it's something rare among wizards of her circle. Kreacher even kept a photo of Bellatrix by his bedside, which clearly indicated her affection for him. This is a rare and strangely human touch in her otherwise terrifying persona. Number 7, she knew the truth about Voldemort's bloodline and accepted it. The Dark Lord built his ideology on the superiority of pure bloods, despite being a half-blood himself. Many see this as proof of his hypocrisy, but for Bellatrix this didn't matter. She knew the truth, but her loyalty ran so deep that Voldemort's ancestry was irrelevant to her. She followed him not because of his blood, but because of his power and beliefs. Number 8. She was ruthless, only toward her enemies. Many believe that Bellatrix Lestrange was ruthless only in battle, directed solely at her enemies, but in truth her cruelty extended far beyond her foes. Her relationship with her own family was chillingly cold. She showed no warmth toward her husband, Rodolphus Lestrange, or her sister Narcissa Malfoy. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Bellatrix openly mocks Narcissa for her concern over Draco, calling her weak for worrying about her son's safety. The sisters' bond was distant, and Bellatrix's disdain for Narcissa's protective nature only added to the tension between them. Despite being family, Bellatrix did not hesitate to belittle Narcissa for not sharing her single-minded devotion to Voldemort. Her relationship with Rodolphus was similarly devoid of affection. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, there's little evidence of any emotional connection between them. Bellatrix was far more consumed by her devotion to Voldemort than by any love or loyalty to her husband. She was willing to sacrifice everything, even those closest to her, for her unwavering allegiance to the Dark Lord. Her ability to show no mercy, even in the most intimate of relationships, is what makes her so terrifying and unpredictable. Bellatrix was not just cruel to her enemies, she was capable of inflicting harm on anyone, regardless of blood ties, if it meant serving Voldemort's cause. Number 9. Bellatrix was invincible. Bellatrix Lestrange was undeniably a strong and skilled fighter, but she was far from invincible. Her fear of losing control or being defeated was one of her greatest weaknesses. This became painfully clear during the final battle at Hogwarts. Bellatrix faced Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ginny Weasley, 3 formidable opponents. As the battle raged on, her bravado and reckless devotion to Voldemort fueled her fury, but it also blinded her to the reality of the situation. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when she is faced with these 3 young witches, she loses her composure, something she relied on for much of her strength. "You dare not fight me," she yells, but her overconfidence and emotional outbursts lead to her downfall. Her inability to stay calm and calculated, as she had in the past, was what ultimately caused her defeat. In the heat of the moment, Bellatrix's focus on vengeance and rage overtook her tactical abilities. She allowed her emotions to control her actions, and in doing so, she lost the precision that had once made her a deadly opponent. As Ginny and the others countered her attacks, Bellatrix's sense of invulnerability shattered. Her own fury became her undoing, revealing that even the most fearsome warriors have their vulnerabilities, and Bellatrix was no exception. Number 10. She was an ideal student of Voldemort. Bellatrix Lestrange was often portrayed as a devoted and loyal follower of Voldemort, but this does not mean she was the perfect student. Despite her unwavering commitment to dark magic, Bellatrix was not as skilled in the magical arts as other Death Eaters like Rudolphus Lestrange or Bartemius Crouch Jr. While she was powerful, Bellatrix lacked the subtlety and discipline that marked the true talents of the most dangerous followers. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, it becomes clear that Bellatrix's emotional and impulsive nature often worked against her. Voldemort, a master of calculation, was frequently frustrated by her inconsistency. He valued efficiency and control, and Bellatrix's unrefined approach made her stand out, but not in a favorable way. For example, during the battle at the Department of Mysteries, Bellatrix's wild behavior contrasted with the more calculated actions of her fellow Death Eaters. While others, like Lucius Malfoy, maintained a level of decorum, Bellatrix threw herself into the chaos, relishing the violence. Her overzealous attitude was not what Voldemort expected from someone in his inner circle. In fact, in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, we see Voldemort criticize Bellatrix's emotionality during a planning session. His displeasure with her impulsiveness was evident when he questioned her strategic mindset. Bellatrix's inability to hide her emotions made her unpredictable, which was not a trait that Voldemort valued in his closest followers. This emotional volatility made Bellatrix stand apart from the other Death Eaters who were more disciplined in their loyalty and actions. Characters like Severus Snape or even Lucius Malfoy kept their true feelings hidden, working under Voldemort's radar without displaying weakness. Bellatrix, on the other hand, wore her loyalty on her sleeve and acted without restraint, which led to moments of failure that would have been unacceptable in Voldemort's eyes. Her loyalty and zeal were beyond question, but when it came to magical precision and the cold, calculating cruelty Voldemort demanded, Bellatrix fell short. In the end, she was more a symbol of devotion than a true master of dark magic. Number 11, Bellatrix, was a religious fanatic. The myth that Bellatrix Lestrange was a religious fanatic is far from the truth. While her devotion to Voldemort and dark magic often appeared fanatical, it was not rooted in any magical religion or spiritual belief. Bellatrix did not worship gods or follow a higher magical power, as some wizards might have. Her beliefs were purely political and ideological, focused on the idea of superiority and the annihilation of those she considered impure. Likely, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, we see this in her unwavering loyalty to Voldemort's cause, where she acts not out of spiritual devotion, but as a disciple of his twisted vision of the world. She viewed him as a figure of ultimate power, not as a divine being to be worshipped. Unlike some of Voldemort's other followers, who may have been drawn to his ideology for personal gain or belief in a new world order, Bellatrix's loyalty was rooted in her fanatical desire to serve him. This is evident when she reveals her true nature during the battle at the Department of Mysteries. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Bellatrix gleefully tortures Hermione, seemingly indifferent to the pain she causes. For Bellatrix, cruelty was not a means to achieve a religious end, but an expression of loyalty to Voldemort's goal of purging the wizarding world of blood traitors and magical impurities. Her lack of emotional connection to the concepts of life and death further supports the idea that Bellatrix was not a religious fanatic. Her approach to death was cold and unfeeling. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, when she murders her cousin Sirius Black in the battle at the Department of Mysteries, there is no sense of hesitation, regret, or belief in an afterlife. Bellatrix does not see death as a transition to a spiritual realm, but as a tool in service of Voldemort's power. She is not motivated by a belief in an afterlife or divine retribution, but by the simple and terrifying drive to destroy those who oppose her cause. Number 12. She was happy in her life. The belief that Bellatrix Lestrange was happy in her life is a misconception. While she enjoyed the power that came with being Voldemort's most loyal servant, her personal life was marked by fear, despair, and isolation. Bellatrix was constantly seeking recognition and love, yet she could never find peace within herself. She may have been feared and respected for her cruelty, but this only masked the deep loneliness she felt. Her relationship with her husband, Rodolphus Lestrange, was particularly cold and distant. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, it's clear that they shared little more than a formal bond, one that was entirely overshadowed by her obsession with Voldemort. Rodolphus, unable to provide the connection she craved, became just another casualty in her pursuit of the Dark Lord's approval. Bellatrix's desire for love was never fulfilled, and this lack of warmth in her personal life likely pushed her deeper into Voldemort's arms. Her fierce devotion to him was a way of escaping the emptiness she felt inside. Her internal conflict is evident when we examine her relationship with her sister, Narcissa. Narcissa was always the more emotionally reserved of the two, but Bellatrix's need for validation and affection from her family remained unrequited. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Bellatrix's interactions with Narcissa are filled with tension and resentment. Bellatrix is openly dismissive of her sister's attempts to keep their families safe, showing that her hunger for Voldemort's approval overshadowed any familial bond. Bellatrix's internal struggles weren't just about a lack of love from her family, they were also rooted in her inability to find her own identity outside of her relationship with Voldemort. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, she clearly revels in her position by his side, but she does so in a way that feels almost desperate. Her extreme actions, like when she tortures Hermione Granger in the Malfoy Manor, are as much about proving her worth to Voldemort as they are about inflicting pain on others. Bellatrix may have been a master of dark magic, but she was also a woman desperately trying to carve out a sense of self through violence and loyalty. Despite her power and influence, Bellatrix was trapped in a life that left her constantly seeking validation. Her devotion to Voldemort filled the void, but it also kept her from ever finding true happiness. Bellatrix's tragedy lies in the fact that the very thing she thought would give her purpose, her devotion to the Dark Lord, was also the source of her deepest pain. She may have been powerful and feared, but she was never truly free. Number 13, Bellatrix was the only woman Voldemort relied on. The idea that Bellatrix Lestrange was the only woman Voldemort relied on is a myth. While it's true that Bellatrix was one of his most loyal and fanatical followers, she was not the only female presence in his life. Narcissa Malfoy, though not a Death Eater, played a crucial role in Voldemort's plans. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, it's clear that Narcissa, despite her outwardly calm demeanor, was deeply involved in Voldemort's schemes, especially when she made the heart-wrenching decision to seek Draco's safety over the Dark Lord's command. In that moment, Narcissa's priorities were not about blind obedience, but her son's survival. Yet despite her defection from Voldemort's direct orders, she still remained close to him, understanding the significance of the greater game at play. Bellatrix, on the other hand, was a different story. Her loyalty was fierce and without question. She followed Voldemort without hesitation, even when it meant committing unspeakable acts. She was brutal, direct, and unyielding in her devotion. This is shown most vividly in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Bellatrix defies the Ministry of Magic to rescue Lord Voldemort from the battle at the Department of Mysteries. Her willingness to sacrifice everything, including her freedom, for him was unmatched. She believed in his cause with an intensity that set her apart from the more cautious or calculating supporters, like Narcissa. Narcissa, though still loyal to Voldemort, was far more pragmatic. Her focus was on her family, particularly her son, Draco. Her actions in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when she lies to Voldemort about Harry's death to protect Draco, reveal a mother's instincts overriding her commitment to the Dark Lord. Narcissa's loyalty to Voldemort was always tainted with self-preservation and the protection of her loved ones. She showed that while she was important in Voldemort's world, her devotion was measured and often secondary to her family's well-being. Bellatrix and Narcissa represent two very different kinds of loyalty in Voldemort's life. Bellatrix's love for the Dark Lord was unquestioning, even at the cost of her own family and happiness. Narcissa's loyalty, while still strong, was more nuanced. She understood that Voldemort's plans were important, but her son's life came first. While Bellatrix may have been the more outwardly devoted of the two, Narcissa's quiet influence was just as vital, proving that Voldemort's connections with women were complex and not limited to one, no matter how fiercely Bellatrix clung to him. Number 14, she was an ideal mother to Delphi. Myth 14, she was an ideal mother to Delphi. In Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, we learn that Bellatrix Lestrange had a daughter named Delphi. However, the idea that Bellatrix was a caring mother is far from the truth. Her obsession with Voldemort overshadowed any real maternal bond she might have had. In fact, we never see any tender moments between Bellatrix and her daughter. Delphi's very existence feels more like an extension of Bellatrix's loyalty to the Dark Lord than an expression of genuine maternal love. Bellatrix's attachment to Delphi seems more like a reflection of her fanatic devotion to Voldemort, rather than the deep affection a mother usually has for her child. Bellatrix's connection to her daughter is chillingly transactional. Delphi is not the product of love, but rather a result of Bellatrix's blind commitment to Voldemort. The fact that Bellatrix would choose to follow Voldemort's ideals over her own daughter is evident when considering her actions. She was willing to risk everything, including Delphi's safety, for the sake of the Dark Lord's cause. There's no indication that Bellatrix ever questioned whether her actions were in her daughter's best interest. To Bellatrix, fulfilling Voldemort's desires was far more important than the well-being of her child. Bellatrix's role as a mother is defined more by what she was willing to sacrifice than by her love. She doesn't hesitate when it comes to serving Voldemort's will, and Delphi becomes an afterthought in her obsession. Bellatrix's allegiance to Voldemort is absolute, and her attachment to Delphi is simply another extension of that devotion. It's a cold, distant relationship where Delphi's existence seems to be more of a duty than a blessing. In Bellatrix's world, there's no room for motherhood as we understand it, only loyalty and subjugation to Voldemort. The absence of a true maternal instinct is starkly apparent when we consider Bellatrix's actions during the Second Wizarding War. The idea of Bellatrix as a doting mother falls apart when we realize that her love for Delphi was likely overshadowed by her desire for power and the Dark Lord's approval. Bellatrix was willing to sacrifice anyone and anything for Voldemort's cause, including her own flesh and blood. Even Delphi, in the end, seems more like a pawn in Bellatrix's larger game of devotion to the Dark Lord than a cherished daughter. This proves that Bellatrix, in the end, was far from the ideal mother. Number 15. She hated Harry Potter, solely because of his opposition to Voldemort. In the wizarding world, few characters embodied the depths of fanaticism, betrayal, and hatred as much as Bellatrix Lestrange. To many, her burning animosity toward Harry Potter is simply a result of his role in the defeat of Lord Voldemort, but such an interpretation overlooks the more complex and personal roots of her hatred. Bellatrix's rage toward Harry was not born out of mere opposition to the Dark Lord's fall. It was deeply intertwined with her twisted allegiance to Voldemort and her fractured relationships with those closest to him. For Bellatrix, Harry Potter was a symbol of everything she had lost and failed to control, and her animosity went far beyond his victory over Voldemort. Her obsession with his destruction was a response not only to his actions, but to the personal, emotional devastation he inadvertently caused her and her family. From the moment Bellatrix met Harry, her hatred was apparent. It wasn't just that Harry defeated Voldemort in a way that seemed to strip her of her purpose and identity, but that the boy who lived represented everything she had lost as a loyal servant to the Dark Lord. For Bellatrix, Voldemort was not just a master, but a god. Her life had been entirely devoted to him, and she had been willing to sacrifice everything, including her family, to see his return to power. Voldemort's temporary defeat at the hands of a mere baby was a blow to her that she could never forgive, especially when Harry continued to grow stronger, defying everything Voldemort had strived for. As long as Harry lived, it felt as though Voldemort's power would remain in jeopardy, And for Bellatrix, that was a deep personal betrayal. However, her hatred for Harry was not solely because of his role in the Dark Lord's fall. Harry's connection to her own family only exacerbated her disdain for him. Bellatrix's relationships with her relatives were fraught with bitterness and jealousy, especially with her niece, Narcissa Malfoy. Narcissa had been another of the family members who remained loyal to Voldemort, but unlike Bellatrix, Narcissa had retained some semblance of humanity, which only served to fuel Bellatrix's insecurities. Narcissa's son Draco was a symbol of what Bellatrix could never have, a more subtle, less fanatical connection to Voldemort. Narcissa's ability to balance her loyalty with love for her family and her own sense of morality was something Bellatrix despised, even though she would never openly admit it. In Bellatrix's eyes, Narcissa had betrayed their cause by showing compassion for Draco, and Harry's relationship with Narcissa's family only reinforced Bellatrix's feeling of alienation from the Malfoys. But Bellatrix's fury toward Harry was not confined to mere familial jealousy. It was compounded by the fact that Harry's very existence threatened her pride. In the final battle at Hogwarts, Harry's courage, his ability to defy Voldemort, and his resilience in the face of death made him a living testament to everything Bellatrix believed had failed her. While she had spent her life serving Voldemort's twisted vision, Harry had fought for something far purer: love, friendship, and a future free of fear. This contrast, one that embodied everything Bellatrix had rejected, made Harry's very existence a thorn in her side. Each time Harry survived an encounter with Voldemort's forces, each time he grew stronger, it felt like a personal affront to Bellatrix's devotion to the Dark Lord. This deep, personal resentment toward Harry was also reflected in Bellatrix's violent encounters with him. When she first saw him during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, her loathing was palpable, not just because of his interference with the Dark Lord's plans, but because of the way Harry's very presence reminded her of the things she had sacrificed. Harry's connection to the prophecy, the fact that he was destined to be Voldemort's ultimate rival, felt like a cruel mockery of Bellatrix's own failed efforts to serve her master. It was as if she were watching someone else claim the prize she had fought for all her life, only for Harry to emerge as Voldemort's equal, his legacy far more significant than her own. Bellatrix's fury toward Harry escalated further when she learned of the relationship between Harry and her nephew, Neville Longbottom. In the wizarding world, Neville was a figure who was often underestimated, yet to Bellatrix, he represented another betrayal of her family. Neville, like Harry, was one of the children who had stood against the Dark Lord's forces, and Bellatrix had encountered him numerous times during the battle for Hogwarts. While Neville's struggles were often framed as a fight for justice, Bellatrix saw him as another example of what she had failed to control. He had, after all, survived the same battles as Harry, but with none of the fanfare or expectations. His role in the eventual defeat of Voldemort, particularly when he destroyed the last Horcrux, only served to remind Bellatrix that Harry was not the only person who had defied the Dark Lord. But where Neville represented resilience through hardship, Harry was the ultimate symbol of everything Bellatrix had lost, everything she could never recover. For Bellatrix, every encounter with Harry Potter felt like a personal loss. She had devoted her life to a cause that ultimately ended in ruin. In contrast, Harry had the strength to rise above the destruction Voldemort had wrought, and in Bellatrix's mind, that was unforgivable. Even when she was imprisoned in Azkaban, her hatred toward Harry never waned. Instead, it festered, turning into an obsession that she would carry to her death. For Bellatrix, Harry was not just an enemy because he had defeated her master. He was an embodiment of everything she had sacrificed, an adversary who had taken everything from her without even realizing it. Number 16. Bellatrix was blinded by her pride for her pure blood status. Bellatrix Lestrange is often remembered as a fervent believer in the supremacy of pure-blood wizards, a loyal follower of Voldemort who despised Muggles and Muggleborns. Her obsession with blood purity is often presented as her primary motivation for aligning with the Dark Lord. However, this view is an oversimplification. Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort was not purely ideological, nor was it rooted in an unwavering belief in pure-blood superiority. In fact, Bellatrix's attachment to Voldemort was far more pragmatic than her family's ideals, and her loyalty was driven by a combination of personal ambition, power, and a desire for protection, attributes that Voldemort uniquely embodied. Bellatrix's obsession with her bloodline is undeniable. Growing up in the Lestrange family and noble house of pure-blood wizards, she was steeped in the ideals of blood purity. The Lestranges, like many other families in the wizarding world, viewed Muggles as inferior and considered their lineage to be the epitome of magical power. Bellatrix's family, including her brothers, were deeply involved in the ideology of pure-blood supremacy, which led them to embrace Voldemort's cause. But Bellatrix's connection to this ideology was not as fundamental as it appeared. She was not the kind of person to adhere blindly to the notion that pure-bloods were inherently superior, as many others did. In fact, her relationship with Voldemort was driven more by a pragmatic desire for power and the protection he offered than any rigid belief in bloodlines. While Bellatrix was undoubtedly a supporter of Voldemort's vision, her loyalty was less about ideological purity and more about the fact that Voldemort represented an opportunity for personal advancement and security. The notion of pure blood supremacy, as emphasized by her family, was certainly a significant factor in her decision to follow Voldemort. But it was Voldemort's charisma, his promises of power, and the position he offered her within his inner circle that truly appealed to her. In many ways, she was a product of her circumstances. Someone who grew up in a world where power and bloodlines were everything, and Voldemort seemed to offer the ultimate combination of both. In her interactions with Voldemort, Bellatrix's devotion is often framed as fanatical, but it is crucial to understand that her loyalty was not a blind devotion to the cause of blood purity. Rather, it was an attachment to a man who embodied power and control, qualities she craved. Unlike many others who saw blood purity as a divine or moral cause, Bellatrix saw Voldemort as the means to achieve her own ends. She was willing to follow him to the ends of the earth, not because of his blood status, but because he represented strength. His magical prowess, his charisma, and his ruthless ambition were what drew her to him. Bellatrix's relationship with Voldemort was complicated and multifaceted. While she undoubtedly admired him and considered him her master, she was also influenced by her own desires for status and power. Her love for him was not purely romantic, but it was certainly deeply emotional. She craved his approval and saw herself as one of his most loyal and capable followers. This relationship is especially apparent in her actions during the First and Second Wizarding Wars. Bellatrix's extreme loyalty to Voldemort was evident in her willingness to commit unspeakable acts on his behalf, including the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom. In this moment, her actions were not driven by a desire to uphold the ideals of pure blood superiority, but by her loyalty to Voldemort and her desire to please him. A pivotal moment in Bellatrix's story is her imprisonment in Azkaban. While many followers of Voldemort were arrested and sent to prison after the Dark Lord's fall, Bellatrix's experience was particularly telling. Her obsession with Voldemort was so deep that it endured even through the years of his absence. Unlike many others who lost faith in him or turned away from his cause, Bellatrix remained unwavering in her loyalty. This loyalty was not based on any rigid belief in blood purity, but rather on her faith in Voldemort as the embodiment of power and authority. Her time in Azkaban did not break her, as it did with others, but rather strengthened her resolve. Bellatrix's time in the prison was, in her mind, a testament to her unwavering loyalty to Voldemort. When Voldemort returned to power, Bellatrix's devotion was once again evident. She was one of the first to rejoin him and, in many ways, became his most trusted follower. Her loyalty was so absolute that she was willing to risk her life for him time and time again. This was evident during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, where Bellatrix fought to the death to protect Voldemort's secrets and ensure his dominance. Her actions in the battle were not motivated by a desire to defend blood purity, but by her deep-seated devotion to Voldemort and her belief that he was the key to her own power. Bellatrix's tragic flaw, however, was her blind pride in her own pure-blood status. She was so obsessed with her bloodline that it blinded her to the true nature of Voldemort's leadership. She saw herself as one of the elite, a member of an ancient and noble house, and believed that her blood status made her deserving of a special place in Voldemort's inner circle. But this pride in her bloodline ultimately led to her downfall. She was so consumed by her belief in the superiority of her family's blood that she was willing to overlook Voldemort's own heritage and his willingness to use anyone, regardless of their blood status, to achieve his goals. In the end, her attachment to her pure-blood identity was as much of a weakness as it was a strength, and it was this blind pride that led her to make fatal mistakes. Number 17. Bellatrix was ruthless toward her enemies, but not her allies. Bellatrix Lestrange is often viewed through the lens of a fiercely loyal follower of Lord Voldemort, a character who has no mercy for her enemies, but is assumed to show a sense of camaraderie or even affection toward her fellow Death Eaters. Many readers and fans of the Harry Potter series cling to the misconception that Bellatrix's cruelty was reserved only for those who opposed her dark master. The idea of her as a protective and nurturing figure toward her allies is a common but erroneous belief. However, Bellatrix's true nature, as revealed throughout the series, paints a very different picture. Her relationships with other Death Eaters, including her fellow colleagues in evil, were far from harmonious and often showed a deep disdain for anyone she deemed as inferior to her own absolute devotion to Voldemort. The belief that Bellatrix Lestrange had a soft spot for her fellow Death Eaters is fundamentally flawed. Her personality was driven by a sense of superiority so intense that it left little room for true loyalty or compassion toward anyone other than Voldemort himself. She considered herself to be among the chosen few, blessed with Voldemort's special favor, and she made it abundantly clear to those around her that they were beneath her. This arrogance is a consistent theme throughout the series and her relationships with her fellow Death Eaters serve as a testament to her lack of empathy or even basic respect for those who shared her cause. One of the clearest examples of Bellatrix's contemptuous treatment of her fellow Death Eaters can be found in her relationship with Barty Crouch Jr., a man whose dedication to Voldemort was unquestionable. Despite their shared allegiance, Bellatrix showed little regard for Barty's feelings or well-being. Her behavior toward him can be described as dismissive at best, cruel at worst. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Barty Crouch Jr. is revealed to be impersonating Mad-Eye Moody and aiding Harry's capture, Bellatrix is quick to criticize him, even mocking his situation. She is quick to remind him of his failures in the past and her cold detachment toward him. Despite their shared goals, paints a stark picture of her unyielding pride. The cruelty that Bellatrix displayed towards Crouch Jr. wasn't just confined to words. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Crouch Jr. is revealed to have been imprisoned in Azkaban for many years, Bellatrix's indifference toward his suffering is chilling. Instead of offering sympathy or understanding, she is more concerned with her own image and status. The very thought that she might have to stoop to offering any comfort to someone like Crouch Jr. never crosses her mind. For Bellatrix, the most important thing is her loyalty to Voldemort, and anyone who fails to meet her standards is of little consequence to her. Bellatrix's attitude toward her own family further reinforces her lack of compassion for those around her. Although she shared blood ties with several prominent Death Eaters, including her husband, Rodolphus Lestrange, and her brother-in-law, Rabastan Lestrange, her relationship with them was marked by the same coldness and self-interest that she exhibited toward her fellow Death Eaters. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, we see the complicated dynamic between Bellatrix and Rodolphus. While they are married, their bond seems more like one of mutual convenience rather than love. Bellatrix is so absorbed in her obsessive loyalty to Voldemort that she has no time or patience for her husband's feelings or needs. Her relationship with Rodolphus, though, is far from being an isolated case. In fact, it can be said that Bellatrix's disdain for her fellow Death Eaters extends even to her own kin. She frequently belittles and mocks those around her, using her connection to Voldemort as a weapon to assert her dominance. She is willing to sacrifice anyone and anything for the sake of Voldemort's cause, without any regard for the consequences or the feelings of those she is close to. This is a far cry from the image of a loyal, compassionate ally, the one who would go out of her way to protect those she fought alongside. Bellatrix's behavior during her time in Azkaban is another key factor in understanding her disregard for others. While many of the Death Eaters who were imprisoned in the wizarding prison began to suffer from the horrors of their confinement, Bellatrix seemed to revel in her time there. She claimed that the time spent in Azkaban had only strengthened her resolve and dedication to Voldemort. However, it's clear that her obsession with him blinded her to the suffering of others, even those who had been in the prison alongside her. When she was finally freed, her utter lack of empathy was evident. There was no sign of regret or remorse for the years she had spent in the dark, and her focus was purely on reconnecting with her master and continuing his mission. Bellatrix's cruelty extended far beyond just her words or attitudes. She was not afraid to use her power and influence within the Death Eater ranks to manipulate and control those around her. For instance, in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Bellatrix and her allies are tasked with capturing Harry and the others at Malfoy Manor, she displays an utter lack of concern for anyone other than herself and Voldemort. She tortures the prisoners mercilessly, showing no hesitation or second thoughts. Her ruthless treatment of others in this context highlights the disturbing extent to which she is willing to go for the sake of achieving her goals. Number 18. Bellatrix was a leader among the Death Eaters. Bellatrix. Lestrange's role in the Death Eater ranks is often misunderstood. While she is recognized as one of Lord Voldemort's most loyal and fanatical followers, the notion that she was a leader among the Death Eaters is misleading. Bellatrix's role was not defined by command or strategy, like figures such as Alecto Carrow or even Bartemius Crouch Jr. Her power lay not in leadership, but in her unyielding devotion to her Dark Lord and her willingness to sacrifice everything for him. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of loyalty, a follower who would do anything to please her master, but she was not the orchestrator of plans nor the master tactician. It's easy to mistake Bellatrix's proximity to Voldemort for authority within the Death Eater ranks. she was among the few who were trusted explicitly by Voldemort, and the bond between them was unmistakable. Her deep affection for him went beyond mere devotion. She was driven by a fervour that bordered on obsession. She adored Voldemort not only for his power, but also for the sense of purpose he gave her. Bellatrix had little interest in the grand political or military tactics of the Death Eater cause. Instead, she saw herself as the ultimate servant, the embodiment of blind obedience. Her loyalty was so absolute that it made her more dangerous than other Death Eaters who operated out of self-interest. In contrast to others like Severus Snape or even Lucius Malfoy, Bellatrix had no political ambition or desire to gain power. Her attachment to Voldemort was spiritual in a sense, as if she were his apostle. Unlike Malfoy, who maneuvered within the political system, or Snape, who played a dangerous double game, Bellatrix had no duality. She was a straightforward weapon in Voldemort's arsenal, willing to execute his orders with ruthless precision. The most striking thing about Bellatrix is that she didn't seek to become a leader. She was perfectly content in her role as a faithful follower, willing to carry out even the darkest tasks without question. For example, her actions in the Department of Mysteries demonstrate her unique brand of fanaticism. In the midst of a life-threatening battle, Bellatrix didn't hesitate to use the unforgivable curses. She killed her cousin, Sirius Black, without a moment's doubt or remorse, even though their families shared ties of blood. To her, loyalty to Voldemort was above all else. This act of betrayal, the murder of a family member, was a testament to her willingness to sacrifice anything, even her own kin, for the Dark Lord's cause. It also reveals the kind of ruthless fanaticism that Bellatrix embodied. There was no question of right or wrong for her, only the commands of her master. This fanatical loyalty was seen again when she tortured Hermione Granger and others at Malfoy Manor. The sheer cruelty Bellatrix exhibited toward prisoners, especially children like Hermione, was not motivated by any personal grudge or ambition. It was the unrelenting devotion to Voldemort's ideals that drove her. Her commitment to his vision was so pure that she viewed those who opposed him as subhuman, undeserving of mercy. This fanaticism made her a more terrifying figure than any who merely followed Voldemort for power or out of fear. While Bellatrix's loyalty to Voldemort was unquestionable, her role among the Death Eaters was never one of authority. She was not a planner or a strategist like Lucius Malfoy or Bellatrix's former master, Tom Riddle. Instead, she was more like a loyal soldier, ready to carry out any task handed to her. This was particularly evident when she was tasked with guarding the prison in the Department of Mysteries. She was not the leader of the assault on the Department of Mysteries, but was fully loyal to Voldemort's mission. In this sense, her leadership among the Death Eaters was a misunderstanding. She was not a commander of troops, but a fierce, relentless warrior who followed orders without hesitation. Bellatrix's unique place within the Death Eaters was also highlighted during the final battle at Hogwarts. Though she fought fiercely and with unmatched intensity, she was not leading the charge. Her role was to follow Voldemort's commands and to be his instrument of vengeance, not to organize or command others. Her zealous loyalty made her one of the most dangerous Death Eaters, but it also isolated her from the actual leadership structure that existed among Voldemort's followers. Her relationship with other prominent Death Eaters also underscores this lack of leadership. While many, like Lucius Malfoy, had their own power bases and agendas, Bellatrix never sought to form alliances or build influence. She was content in her role as a devoted servant, allowing others to take the lead. For example, during the battle at Malfoy Manor, Bellatrix took orders directly from Voldemort and followed them without hesitation, even when it meant torturing and murdering innocents. This unquestioning obedience was Bellatrix's greatest strength, and it was also the reason why she would never become a leader within the ranks of the Death Eaters. One can compare Bellatrix to figures like Bartemius Crouch Jr., whose loyalty to Voldemort was undoubted, but who had a much more strategic mind. Crouch Jr. had ambitions of his own within the Death Eater ranks and sought to prove his worth by organizing plans and working as a spy. Bellatrix, in contrast, was more a pawn than a player in the game of power. She would carry out any task Voldemort set before her, but she was not interested in the mechanics of the war or in manipulating others for personal gain. In this way, Bellatrix was more like a religious zealot than a political strategist. Her understanding of Voldemort's vision was absolute, and she followed it blindly. Her obsession with the Dark Lord was so total that she could not conceive of any form of rebellion or questioning. This is why she was so fanatical in her loyalty and so dangerous in her willingness to do anything for Voldemort. However, it is also why she could never take on the mantle of leadership within the Death Eaters. Bellatrix's role as a fanatic and a follower is further demonstrated in her treatment of those who failed Voldemort. Her attitude towards failure was not one of pragmatic forgiveness, but of contempt and disgust. She had no tolerance for weakness, and anyone who failed in their duties to Voldemort was an object of her disdain. This can be seen in her interactions with the other Death Eaters, especially those who had been captured and imprisoned. While figures like Snape were allowed to rejoin the ranks due to their valuable contributions, Bellatrix viewed any form of failure as an unforgivable sin. This inflexibility further confirmed her role as a servant rather than a leader. In contrast to other Death Eaters who might have had personal goals or ambitions, Bellatrix's sole focus was on serving Voldemort. Her lack of personal ambition was a defining feature. She was not in the Death Eaters for self-glory, power, or wealth, but to serve her master. This made her a uniquely loyal follower, but also a follower without the authority or autonomy that some of her peers enjoyed. Bellatrix's loyalty to Voldemort defined her, but it also made her an outsider in terms of leadership. Bellatrix's ability to carry out Voldemort's will without hesitation, her willingness to sacrifice everything for him, and her complete devotion to his cause all contribute to the misconception that she was a leader. While she was certainly one of the Dark Lord's most trusted followers, she was never the strategist or commander of the Death Eaters. Instead, her power lay in her role as the perfect servant, the one who would never question orders, never hesitate to kill, and never betray the Dark Lord. Her leadership was, in a sense, purely symbolic. She was a beacon of absolute loyalty, but never a figure of authority or power within the ranks of Voldemort's inner circle. Number 19. Bellatrix could not be sincere. The notion that Bellatrix Lestrange was incapable of sincerity has been a prevailing assumption among many fans of the Harry Potter series. She is often remembered as the epitome of sadistic cruelty, a woman whose sole devotion was to Lord Voldemort and whose heart seemed as cold as the stone walls of Azkaban. But if we dig deeper into her character, we begin to see that this image of Bellatrix as a one-dimensional villain fails to capture the complexity of her emotional landscape. While it's true that Bellatrix was brutal, violent, and obsessive, there were moments in her life that suggest she was more than just a cold, heartless monster. One of these moments was her relationship with Kreacher, the Black family house elf. Kreacher, like all house elves, was bound to serve his masters without question. He was an odd creature, loyal yet resentful, bound by both love and hatred for the family he served. When Bellatrix returned to the Black family home, Grimmauld Place, she was far from pleased to find Kreacher still living there. Her first interaction with him was harsh, but it was not entirely devoid of emotion. Unlike her relatives, who treated Creature with disdain and neglect, Bellatrix showed him a certain degree of attachment. This attachment is noteworthy given her otherwise cold nature. She did not merely see him as a tool to be used or discarded. Instead, she took the time to understand him, albeit in her own twisted way. Bellatrix's affection for Creature, while certainly not an example of kindness in the traditional sense, revealed a different side of her. She showed Creature an unusual amount of care, albeit in a very possessive and domineering manner. She took him under her wing, making him one of her few companions in the world. Creature, who had always yearned for approval and affection from the Black family, found something of that in Bellatrix. She was the one who paid attention to him, the one who acknowledged his existence, even if that acknowledgement was brutal in its execution. This dynamic between Bellatrix and Creature is not without its complexities. Creature was bound to the Black family by blood, and his relationship with Bellatrix was tainted by this fact. But there is a moment in the story when Bellatrix's actions suggest that she was not entirely devoid of emotion. When Creature returned to Grimmauld Place after the battle at the Ministry of Magic, he brought with him a sense of satisfaction in his loyalty to Bellatrix, despite her abusive treatment of him. He had fulfilled her commands, but more than that, he had earned her approval, something that was not given freely to most people, even those she cared about. Creature's role in the battle, where he played a small but crucial part in helping the Order of the Phoenix, was not overlooked by Bellatrix. She had a twisted sense of pride in his loyalty, even if it was the result of a dark and unhealthy relationship. In fact, Bellatrix's treatment of Creature can be seen as a form of emotional attachment. While she may not have shown love in the way that most people would expect, she demonstrated her loyalty to him in a way that suggests she was capable of feeling something for him. She allowed herself to care, in her own warped and controlling way, for the Creature who served her. This is a significant departure from the image of Bellatrix as a woman incapable of real emotion. Her behavior toward Creature contrasts sharply with how she treated others, especially those who did not belong to her immediate circle of allegiance. Bellatrix's interactions with other characters, particularly those outside of the Death Eater circle, were often marked by cruelty, but her actions toward Creature show that she was not entirely devoid of warmth. It is this contradiction that makes her character so fascinating and difficult to categorize. Bellatrix's relationship with Creature speaks to a deeper emotional complexity within her that is often overlooked. Despite her zealous devotion to Voldemort, which defined much of her existence, Bellatrix was not without the capacity for affection. Her bond with Creature is not one of conventional love or compassion, but it does demonstrate that she was capable of forming attachments that were rooted in something more than just loyalty or duty. Bellatrix, in her own twisted way, had the ability to care for others, but this caring was always infused with control, manipulation, and violence. This complexity is further highlighted by her relationship with her family. Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort was in many ways a reflection of her relationship with her family, particularly her father. The Lestranges were a family steeped in pure blood ideology, with a long history of wizarding superiority and dark magic. Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort was not just about her loyalty to him, it was about her belief in the superiority of blood purity, a belief that had been instilled in her from a young age. But even within her family, Bellatrix showed moments of affection, particularly toward her cousin Narcissa. Although Bellatrix was ruthless in her pursuit of power, she demonstrated a fierce loyalty to her family, which is a form of love in its own right. It was this loyalty that led her to make certain sacrifices for her family, including her willingness to go to great lengths to protect them from harm. Bellatrix's emotional attachments were always complicated by her sense of superiority and her obsession with Voldemort. She was a woman who was consumed by her beliefs, by her devotion to her Dark Lord, and by her hatred of those who opposed him. But this does not mean that she was entirely incapable of real emotion. In fact, her emotional landscape was shaped by the very beliefs that drove her to be so ruthless. Her love for Voldemort, while distorted and obsessive, was genuine. It was a love that defined her existence, and it was a love that consumed her every action. Bellatrix's relationship with Voldemort is a key example of how she was capable of deep emotions, even though those emotions were often warped by her ideology. She idolized Voldemort in a way that bordered on fanaticism, but this adoration was not a mere surface-level devotion. Bellatrix believed in his vision, in his goals, and in his superiority. She was not just a follower, she was a true believer, and that belief was rooted in deep emotional attachment. For Bellatrix, Voldemort was not just a master, he was a godlike figure, and her devotion to him transcended mere duty or fear. While Bellatrix's actions were often fueled by her blind loyalty to Voldemort, they were also motivated by a desire to prove herself worthy of his affection. This need for validation was a driving force behind many of her actions. She sought his approval, his praise, and his recognition, and she was willing to go to great lengths to earn it. This speaks to her emotional vulnerability, a vulnerability that she often tried to mask with her cruelty and arrogance. Even in her moments of madness, Bellatrix's emotional depth cannot be denied. She was a woman who, despite her many flaws, was capable of feeling deeply. Her love for Voldemort, her attachment to Kreacher, and her fierce loyalty to her family all demonstrate that Bellatrix was not the heartless monster that many believed her to be. She was a woman who was shaped by her beliefs, by her love, and by the trauma of her past. Her emotions may have been distorted by these forces, but they were still real. Bellatrix's emotional complexity is a testament to the fact that no character in the Harry Potter universe is entirely one-dimensional. Even the most seemingly evil characters like Bellatrix are capable of real feelings and emotional attachments. Bellatrix's love for Voldemort, her bond with Kreacher, and her devotion to her family all serve as reminders that while she may have been a villain, she was also a deeply human character whose actions were driven by the same emotions that drive us all. Number 20. She had no fear. Bellatrix Lestrange has long been portrayed as a figure of absolute fearlessness and unyielding strength, a woman whose devotion to the Dark Lord Voldemort and her cruel, sadistic nature made her appear impervious to any form of terror. In many ways, she was viewed as the epitome of a witch who, driven by her loyalty and thirst for power, transcended normal human emotions, including fear. However, this perception of Bellatrix as an invincible force is not entirely accurate. Beneath her terrifying exterior, Bellatrix harbored deep-seated fears that, rather than weakening her, fueled her cruelty and unrelenting pursuit of control. These fears were not easily visible, nor did they manifest in conventional ways. Instead, they lay dormant beneath her skin, masked by her aggressive behavior and dark persona, becoming a driving force in her actions. One of the most poignant and revealing moments in understanding Bellatrix's hidden fear can be traced back to her time in Azkaban, the infamous wizarding prison, where she was imprisoned for her role in the torture and murder of countless innocents. During her time there, Bellatrix, like many others who endured the prison's horrors, faced the terrifying presence of Dementors. These wraith-like creatures who fed on despair and hopelessness were a constant presence in the dark, damp cells of Azkaban. For most, their presence was enough to break even the most resilient of spirits. Yet Bellatrix, renowned for her toughness and unwavering loyalty to Voldemort, was not immune. In fact, her experiences with the Dementors left an indelible mark on her psyche, one that would shape her actions and behavior for years to come. Dementors have a unique ability to tap into a person's deepest fears and darkest memories, feeding off their most traumatic experiences. For Bellatrix, who had once been a proud member of the Black family and a key supporter of Voldemort, her fear was rooted in vulnerability. The vulnerability of being trapped and helpless, the loss of control. In Azkaban, she was forced to relive the most horrifying aspects of her life, her sense of betrayal, the loss of power, and her own deep fear of weakness. The Dementors, in their chilling way, amplified these fears, magnifying them to the point of madness. Bellatrix's mind. Once a fortress of loyalty and hatred began to crumble under the weight of her own panic. Despite her fierce pride, she was not immune to the emotional devastation these creatures inflicted. In fact, her time in Azkaban caused Bellatrix to become more isolated, more disconnected from her own emotions. The pain of her imprisonment, coupled with the relentless influence of the Dementors, fractured her sense of self. However, this experience did not cause her to break. It only pushed her deeper into the path of cruelty. When Bellatrix was eventually freed from Azkaban, she was a changed woman. The once proud, haughty member of the Black family had been remade into a more vicious, unrelenting force. Her fear twisted into hatred and her desire for control heightened by her past torment. Her fear of the Dementors, however, was not simply a fear of the creatures themselves. It was a fear of losing her grip on reality, a fear of being trapped in a state of helplessness once again. The Dementors represented not just an external threat, but a reminder of her own internal vulnerability. Bellatrix's fear was not just of losing her power, but of being reduced to the terrified, trembling shell of a person she had been in Azkaban. Her fear of the Dementors thus evolved into a need to dominate, to exert control over others, and to never again find herself in a position where she was at the mercy of forces beyond her control. This intense need for control manifested in her relationships with others. Bellatrix's cruelty was not simply a reflection of her loyalty to Voldemort, but a reflection of her desire to keep her fears at bay. She projected an image of unyielding strength, of a woman whose unwavering devotion to the Dark Lord made her fearless. But in truth, this facade was a defense mechanism, a way to hide the vulnerability that lay beneath. Bellatrix's cruelty was her shield, a way to keep others at a distance and prevent them from seeing the cracks in her armor. The darker and more brutal she became, the less likely it was that anyone would perceive her as weak. This need to conceal her fear was evident in the way Bellatrix treated others, particularly those who were considered to be weaker or less loyal to Voldemort. She was particularly harsh toward those who showed any sign of weakness or fear. In many ways, Bellatrix sought to project her own sense of invulnerability onto others, forcing them to confront their own fears and insecurities. Her violent outbursts, her cruel punishments, and her sadistic pleasure in causing others pain were all attempts to maintain the illusion of invincibility. The more she could make others suffer, the more she could convince herself that she had triumphed over her own fears. Bellatrix's relationship with her family, especially her sister Narcissa, also reflected her fear-driven need for control. While Narcissa was often portrayed as more reserved and cautious, Bellatrix's fierce loyalty to Voldemort and her willingness to do whatever it took to prove her worth stemmed from a deep-seated fear of not being enough. In her eyes, to be anything less than wholly devoted to the Dark Lord was to show weakness. This fear of inadequacy drove her to constantly prove herself, not just to Voldemort, but to herself. Every act of cruelty, every moment of terror was an attempt to validate her own sense of power and control. In many ways, Bellatrix's relationship with her sister became a reflection of her own inner turmoil. Narcissa, who was more focused on her family's safety, symbolized the life Bellatrix feared losing, the life of someone who could love without fear, without the constant need for domination. Bellatrix's fear of vulnerability also played a significant role in her relationship with her master Voldemort. While many viewed her as the Dark Lord's most loyal follower, Bellatrix's devotion was not simply a product of her love for Voldemort, but also a reflection of her own deep-seated fear. Voldemort, who demanded unwavering loyalty and power, represented the ultimate authority, the ultimate figure of control. Bellatrix's allegiance to him was as much about her fear of losing control over her own fate as it was about her admiration for his power. She needed him not just as a source of power, but as a way to silence the fears that constantly whispered in the back of her mind. In the final moments of her life, as Bellatrix faced her inevitable end at the hands of Molly Weasley, it became clear that her fear had not been vanquished. It was not the fear of death that gripped her, but the fear of failure, the fear of not being enough, of not living up to the expectations she had set for herself. Her death was not the end of her terror, but a culmination of the fears that had shaped her every action. Bellatrix had spent her entire life suppressing her vulnerability, hiding it beneath a mask of cruelty and invincibility. But in the end, it was that very fear, that very need for control, that led to her downfall. In examining Bellatrix Lestrange, it becomes clear that her most defining trait was not her invulnerability, but her vulnerability. Her fear, disguised as cruelty, drove her to commit atrocities to silence her own pain by inflicting it on others. She was not the fearless, invincible figure many believed her to be, but rather a deeply scarred individual whose greatest fear was the loss of control. The cruelty she displayed was not a reflection of strength, but of a deep-seated terror that she could never fully escape. Bellatrix Lestrange was in many ways a tragic figure, one whose fears defined her actions and whose need for control ultimately led to her destruction. Number 21. Bellatrix was always part of the pure blood culture. The story of Bellatrix Lestrange is one of deep contradiction and complexity, particularly when it comes to her relationship with the culture of pure-blood wizardry. At first glance, she seems to embody the very essence of the ideology of blood purity, the belief that only those with pure magical lineage should have access to the magical world. She was a fervent follower of Voldemort, completely dedicated to his cause of purging the wizarding world of muggles and muggleborns, and yet her own connection to pureblood society was far from straightforward. Unlike many other purebloods, such as Lucius Malfoy, who were born into wealth and social status, Bellatrix's attachment to pureblood ideals was not rooted in family tradition. For Lucius, his pride in his heritage was ingrained from a young age, and his family had long been an influential part of the wizarding aristocracy. The Malfoys had always been a family that upheld the values of blood purity, so their loyalty to Voldemort came naturally, a continuation of their long-standing belief in the superiority of purebloods. Bellatrix, however, was not born into the same kind of family. While her family, the Black family, was certainly high-ranking in pureblood circles, it was not a family steeped in the same kind of old-fashioned pride and power as the Malfoys. Bellatrix's personal drive and passion for Voldemort's cause came not from a deep-seated belief in the superiority of purebloods, but from a singular devotion to him. It was this intense, almost obsessive admiration for Voldemort that set her apart from many of the other Death Eaters. While others, like the Malfoys, were motivated by social position, heritage, and a belief in blood purity, Bellatrix's motivation was almost entirely personal. Her unyielding loyalty to Voldemort transcended any notions of family tradition or blood superiority. In this way, her relationship with the pure-blood culture was not one of inherent entitlement, but rather of adherence to a set of beliefs that she adopted to serve her own devotion to the Dark Lord. Her lack of pride in her own family's legacy is apparent in the way she treated her own blood relatives. Despite being born into the prestigious Black family, Bellatrix did not show the same reverence for the family name as her cousins, like Sirius and Andromeda. The Black family, with its rich lineage of dark wizards, was known for its rigid adherence to the pure-blood ideology, but Bellatrix did not seem to share the same attachment to it as her family members. While the Blacks prided themselves on their long history of magical prowess and blood purity, Bellatrix's loyalty was ultimately to Voldemort and his vision of the magical world, not to her family's heritage. This is most clearly illustrated in Bellatrix's relationship with her cousin, Sirius Black. While Sirius rejected the family's values and chose to fight for the Order of the Phoenix, Bellatrix's loyalty to Voldemort made her an adversary to him. For her, family ties were secondary to her devotion to the Dark Lord. In her eyes, the blood purity ideology represented a means to an end, a tool to achieve the ultimate goal of serving Voldemort's will. The traditional family values that had shaped the Black family were not enough to hold her loyalty. She was willing to forsake them entirely in favor of Voldemort, who she viewed as the true embodiment of her ideals. Bellatrix's disregard for traditional pureblood values is further evidenced by her marriage to Rodolphus Lestrange, a match that, while still arranged, seemed to be motivated by something other than pureblood status. In fact, it was likely that Bellatrix's marriage was more a political and social maneuver, a way to cement her position within Voldemort's inner circle, rather than a reflection of any deeply held beliefs about blood purity. Her choice to marry Rodolphus was not about continuing the legacy of the Black family, nor was it about upholding the ideals of pure-blood society. It was instead an alliance that furthered her relationship with Voldemort and solidified her place among the ranks of his most devoted followers. What truly made Bellatrix different from other purebloods was her almost fanatical devotion to Voldemort. She was not merely a follower of his ideology, she was a willing and eager instrument of his will. Unlike other Death Eaters who might have been drawn to Voldemort because of his promises of power or the allure of blood purity, Bellatrix saw him as a savior. She believed in his vision of a world where purebloods ruled and Muggleborns were subjugated, but her loyalty to him went far beyond any ideological framework. Bellatrix did not just share Voldemort's belief in blood purity, she idolized him, and her service to him was more personal than political. In fact, Bellatrix's commitment to Voldemort was so intense that she was willing to abandon every other part of her life for him. She was not only willing to abandon her family, as she did when she became a Death Eater, but she also cast aside her own personal freedom. In Azkaban, after being arrested for torturing the Longbottoms, Bellatrix was content to languish in prison, knowing that it was her devotion to Voldemort that had brought her there. She did not regret her actions, nor did she express any desire to be freed from her confinement. Her only concern was Voldemort's return, and when he did return, she was among the first to pledge herself to his service once again. Bellatrix's allegiance to Voldemort was a defining characteristic of her identity, and she saw her role as his most loyal servant as her ultimate purpose in life. This unwavering loyalty was evident in her actions during the First and Second Wizarding Wars. Throughout both conflicts, Bellatrix was not only a follower of Voldemort, but one of his most trusted and feared followers. Her actions during these wars were not motivated by a desire to gain power or prestige within the wizarding world, but by her love and reverence for Voldemort himself. She did not see herself as a mere pawn in his game, but as a warrior who was serving a higher cause. In this sense, Bellatrix's loyalty to Voldemort transcended the very ideology of blood purity that had initially brought her to him. For her, the Dark Lord was more than just a symbol of pure blood supremacy. He was the embodiment of everything she believed in, and she would follow him to the ends of the earth. Bellatrix's relationship with pureblood culture, therefore, was not a simple one. It was a relationship defined by her personal devotion to Voldemort, a devotion that made her willing to abandon the very ideals that had once been the foundation of pureblood society. While other purebloods may have clung to their family traditions and heritage, Bellatrix was willing to sacrifice it all for the sake of Voldemort. She was not a true representative of pureblood culture, but rather a radical outsider who used it as a means to an end. Her attachment to the ideology of blood purity was not inherited or deeply ingrained, but was instead a product of her personal obsession with Voldemort and his vision of the wizarding world. In the end, Bellatrix Lestrange's story is not one of loyalty to a family or to a culture, but of an all-consuming devotion to a single man. She was a woman who saw in Voldemort not just a leader, but a godlike figure whose ideals were worth sacrificing everything for. She was willing to forsake everything, her family, her name, and even her freedom, to serve him, and in doing so, she became one of the most feared and loyal Death Eaters in Voldemort's ranks. Her devotion to him was her defining characteristic, and it was this loyalty that ultimately led her to her demise. Bellatrix's relationship with pure-blood culture may have been complex, but her relationship with Voldemort was simple and absolute. She was his servant, and nothing else mattered. Number 22, Bellatrix remained loyal to Voldemort until the end. Bellatrix Lestrange was one of the most devoted and fanatical followers of Lord Voldemort, a character known for her fierce loyalty to the Dark Lord. Many readers, especially those who followed the Harry Potter series, have accepted her unwavering allegiance to Voldemort as an unquestionable truth. However, when examining Bellatrix's journey throughout the series, it becomes clear that her loyalty was not as solid as it initially appeared. While she certainly remained one of Voldemort's most zealous followers, her devotion was complicated and increasingly fraught with internal conflict, especially as the war began to turn against him. Bellatrix's unwavering loyalty is often depicted in her actions and words throughout the series. From her fanatical devotion to the Dark Lord to her brutal treatment of others, including torture and murder, Bellatrix seems the very embodiment of a loyal servant. Yet the closer we look at her character, the more we begin to question her commitment to Voldemort's cause. The first signs of Bellatrix's internal struggle begin to surface after Voldemort's apparent defeat at the hands of Harry Potter. It's during these years, while Voldemort is hiding and regrouping, that Bellatrix's devotion is tested. Despite her public proclamations of loyalty, her actions during this period reveal cracks in her once unshakable commitment. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Bellatrix is shown imprisoned in Azkaban for her role in torturing Neville Longbottom's parents, Alice and Frank, into madness. Although she remains vocal in her admiration for Voldemort, she is nonetheless captured and imprisoned by the Ministry of Magic. Her imprisonment highlights the first true chink in the armor of her devotion. Although Bellatrix continues to justify her actions and praises Voldemort from behind bars, there is a sense of helplessness that cannot be ignored. She spends many years locked away, feeling abandoned and powerless, unable to serve the Dark Lord, and her loyalty, though still present, seems somewhat hollow. When Voldemort returns to power in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Bellatrix is one of the first to answer his call. She is released from Azkaban, where she was held for her crimes, and is welcomed back into Voldemort's ranks. Her appearance at the Quidditch World Cup, where she and her fellow Death Eaters wreak havoc on the Muggle spectators, marks her re-emergence into the world of dark magic and violence. Bellatrix, upon her return, is as ruthless and fanatical as ever, torturing those who cross her path without a second thought. However, there is a subtle shift in her character, one that becomes more apparent as the story progresses. Despite Bellatrix's outward enthusiasm and her eagerness to serve Voldemort, she begins to show signs of nervousness as Voldemort's actions become more erratic. The deeper the Dark Lord descends into his paranoia, the more Bellatrix starts to question the cost of her allegiance. This internal conflict comes to a head during the events of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, when Voldemort's reign of terror intensifies. In this book, Bellatrix is not only concerned with her place within Voldemort's hierarchy, but also with the growing power of other factions that threaten her survival. A particular example of her wavering loyalty comes when she witnesses Voldemort's treatment of his followers. Bellatrix's obsession with her own status and her fear of losing her power lead her to start questioning whether Voldemort will be able to maintain control. As Voldemort's failures mount and his grip on the wizarding world begins to falter, Bellatrix's resolve weakens. She is still fiercely loyal to him, but her fear of losing everything she has fought for begins to cloud her judgment. In moments of quiet reflection, she may have started to wonder if her devotion was worth the sacrifices she had made. Bellatrix's fears are ultimately confirmed during the Battle of Hogwarts, where Voldemort's forces are dealt a crushing blow. As the final confrontation approaches, it becomes evident that Bellatrix is not as unwavering as she once seemed. In her mind, her survival is far more important than any cause she could serve. Throughout the battle, Bellatrix shows signs of panic as it becomes clear that Voldemort's defeat is imminent. As the walls close in, she becomes increasingly desperate, fighting with the same intensity but also with the awareness that the world she had fought to create was slipping away. The pivotal moment in Bellatrix's internal conflict comes when she faces off against Molly Weasley in the final stages of the battle. When Molly defeats her in a duel, it is a clear representation of how Bellatrix's loyalty was no longer absolute. Her death symbolizes not just the end of her life, but also the end of her role as a staunch supporter of Voldemort's vision. Despite the fact that she had been one of his most loyal followers for many years, her inability to accept the impending defeat and her personal fears of losing everything ultimately led to her demise. Her final moments are tragic, as Bellatrix is not only defeated physically but also spiritually. She dies clinging to the hope that Voldemort's power would somehow endure, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This fear, this underlying doubt about Voldemort's ability to triumph, has been there all along, but was buried under her violent fanaticism. When the time came, she could no longer maintain the illusion of invulnerability that Voldemort had once promised her. Her death reveals that even the most loyal servants of the Dark Lord can be torn by doubt and fear, and in Bellatrix's case, these emotions led to her undoing. Bellatrix's story is a tragic one because it shows that loyalty, even when outwardly unshakable, can be fragile. Despite her deep and lasting belief in Voldemort's mission, Her personal insecurities and fears ultimately led her to question her place in his world. Even in the heat of battle, when Voldemort's death is becoming inevitable, Bellatrix remains in denial, desperately clinging to the hope that she had made the right choices. In the end, it is not just the physical forces arrayed against Voldemort that bring about his fall, but the inner turmoil of his most loyal followers, like Bellatrix, who slowly begin to see that the world Voldemort promised was nothing more than a hollow dream. Thus, Bellatrix Lestrange's loyalty to Voldemort, though fierce and relentless at times, was not as absolute as it first appeared. Her story reveals that even the most fanatical supporters of a cause can be haunted by doubt, and that loyalty, especially in the face of inevitable defeat, is far more complex than it may seem. Bellatrix's internal struggle, her fear of losing everything, and her ultimate downfall show that no one, not even the most devoted follower, is immune to the powerful forces of fear and uncertainty that come with the realization that the end is near. Number 23. Bellatrix was always on Voldemort's side. Bellatrix Lestrange was one of Voldemort's most loyal followers, an unyielding devotee of his dark cause. Her passion for the Dark Lord was intense and unwavering, or so it seemed. However, beneath the surface of her fierce allegiance lay doubts and contradictions, elements of her character that were only fully revealed in the aftermath of Voldemort's fall. The truth about Bellatrix's loyalty to Voldemort is not as straightforward as many believe. She was not the unquestioning servant of the Dark Lord that history has often painted her as. There were moments in time, particularly when Voldemort's power seemed broken, when Bellatrix's faith was tested and her loyalty to him wavered. When Voldemort was defeated at the hands of Harry Potter, much of his following was left in disarray. The Dark Lord's supporters had no clear leader to follow, and the wizarding world, for a brief period, seemed to be free from the threat that had plagued it for years. Bellatrix, like many of Voldemort's followers, had to grapple with a new reality, one in which the Dark Lord was no longer an immediate presence. During this time of uncertainty, Bellatrix's feelings of devotion began to shift. She was not one to bend easily, nor was she one to simply wait for a leader to rise. Her impatience with the current situation was apparent. She had always been accustomed to power, to the notion that the strong lead and the weak follow. With Voldemort's downfall, she was suddenly adrift in a world where strength no longer commanded unquestioning respect. Bellatrix's first instinct was not to wait idly for Voldemort's return, but to look for someone else who could offer her the power and respect she so craved. There were whispers among the magical community, rumors of ambitious dark wizards who sought to fill the void left by Voldemort. Bellatrix was not one to shy away from power, and when she thought Voldemort was no longer a viable leader, she did not hesitate to entertain the idea of aligning herself with others who might offer her the dominance she desired. Her sharp mind quickly recognized that Voldemort's absence from the scene meant that a power vacuum had formed, and that vacuum could easily be filled by someone else. It wasn't just her loyalty to Voldemort that was at stake. It was her sense of purpose, her identity as a powerful witch. The shift in her thoughts became apparent when, after Voldemort's fall, she did not immediately return to the Death Eater's ranks. She was not the first to rush to his side, to wait for his resurgence. Instead, she allowed herself to entertain other possibilities, even as she continued to keep her distance from the remaining Death Eaters. Bellatrix's loyalty, it seemed, had always been tied to Voldemort's strength. When he was no longer in a position of power, she questioned whether her allegiance to him was truly worth the risks. Her devotion was not rooted in blind loyalty, but in a pragmatic recognition of power. She was loyal to him as long as he was the strongest, as long as he could provide her with the position she had long desired. in the magical world. Her wavering loyalty to Voldemort came into sharp focus when she considered following other wizards. After all, Voldemort's defeat had proven that no one, not even the most powerful dark wizard of all time, was invincible. The idea that there were other potential leaders, other individuals who could lead her to the kind of power she sought, was tempting to Bellatrix. The allure of new power and opportunity was something she couldn't easily dismiss. In this light, her devotion to Voldemort was revealed to be conditional. It was not unconditional loyalty, as many might believe, but rather a loyalty built upon the foundation of strength and power. Her commitment to him was dependent on his ability to maintain control, to assert dominance. When Voldemort was no longer a clear force in the magical world, Bellatrix's devotion faltered, even if only for a time. However, Bellatrix's doubts were not long-lasting. The return of Voldemort, his resurrection and subsequent rise to power, brought her back into his fold. The moment she witnessed his return, when she saw him standing before her once again in his full power, all of her doubts seemed to evaporate. In his presence, she felt the strength that had initially drawn her to him. It was clear to her that Voldemort had reclaimed his position as the Dark Lord, and her faith in him was restored. The idea of following another dark wizard faded away as she realized that despite everything, Voldemort was still the most powerful wizard in existence. His power was something that could not be easily dismissed, even by the likes of Bellatrix Lestrange. What is perhaps most fascinating about Bellatrix's journey is that in the end, her loyalty was never truly about Voldemort as a person. It was about the strength he embodied and the power he represented. Her commitment to him was always tied to his ability to maintain control over the wizarding world. It was not love or devotion in the traditional sense, but a belief that Voldemort was the key to her success and survival. She believed that standing by his side was the only way she could rise to the heights she sought. In this sense, her loyalty was more strategic than emotional, more political than personal. Bellatrix's attachment to Voldemort was never an expression of faith in his ideology or his vision for the wizarding world. Instead, it was an expression of her need for power and recognition, something Voldemort offered more than any other wizard at the time. Despite her doubts during Voldemort's absence, Bellatrix's ultimate return to his side proves the power of the Dark Lord's hold over her. When he finally revealed himself to be the greatest force in the magical world once again, Bellatrix was quick to throw her full support behind him. She had tested the waters, considered other options, but in the end, she knew that no one else could give her what Voldemort could: the power she craved, the respect she desired, and the sense of purpose she needed. She was a woman of fierce ambition, and she realized that only by standing with the strongest could she achieve her goals. Voldemort's return allowed her to reaffirm her place at his side, where she would remain until the very end. Bellatrix's return to Voldemort's side was marked by a fierce loyalty that could never again be questioned. She had seen the power that other wizards might offer her, but none could compare to the strength of Voldemort. In her eyes, there was no longer any doubt that he was the true leader of the magical world, and she was more than willing to dedicate herself fully to his cause. She had once wavered, but in the end, Voldemort's power and the promise of greater things to come brought her back into his fold. Her commitment was not blind, but it was unwavering once she had seen that his strength was undiminished. Bellatrix's loyalty in the analyses was a reflection of the unyielding need for power and dominance that defined her very existence. When Voldemort rose to power once more, Bellatrix's loyalty was proven beyond any doubt. She was one of his most trusted and loyal followers, a fierce supporter who would do anything to see his reign succeed. The doubts that had plagued her during his absence were gone, replaced by an even greater desire to see him triumph. Her faith had been tested, but in the end, Voldemort's strength had proven to be the anchor that held her loyalty firm. Bellatrix Lestrange's devotion to Voldemort was not the result of blind worship, but rather the product of her recognition of his power, something she could never truly walk away from. Number 24, Bellatrix was known for her personal magical research. In the world of wizardry, few figures have sparked as much intrigue and fear as Bellatrix Lestrange. A prominent member of the Death Eaters, Bellatrix was a true follower of Lord Voldemort, loyal to a fault, and an epitome of ferocity and madness. However, what often goes overlooked is a misconception about her. While she was undoubtedly feared for her ruthless actions and her mastery of dark magic, there is a persistent belief that Bellatrix Lestrange was heavily involved in personal magical research, much like her contemporaries Severus Snape or Tom Riddle. But this is a fallacy. Bellatrix, for all her passion and skill, was not a scholar of magic in the traditional sense. Her magic was not rooted in theoretical pursuits or groundbreaking discoveries. Instead, Bellatrix's understanding of magic was practical, intuitive, and entirely action-oriented. Unlike figures such as Severus Snape, whose quiet, meticulous approach to magic allowed him to develop complex spells and potions, or Tom Riddle, who later became Lord Voldemort and sought to unlock the deepest, most ancient secrets of magic, Bellatrix had no particular interest in magical theory or innovation. She was not the type to spend long hours in libraries combing through dusty tomes in search of a new discovery. For her, magic was a tool of domination, a means to an end. She used it to serve her own desires, to instill fear, and, ultimately, to carry out the will of Voldemort. Bellatrix was not a theoretical magician, but a practitioner. Her talents were showcased through her actions, her ability to fight and kill with incredible efficiency. She was a powerful duelist, well known for her raw aggression and unrelenting style in combat. Her proficiency in the dark arts was undeniable, and her reputation for causing pain and destruction was legendary. However, while other Death Eaters sought to unlock the mysteries of magic, Bellatrix's focus remained firmly on wielding it with devastating results. Her aptitude for dueling was well documented. In the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, Bellatrix faced off against some of the most formidable wizards and witches of the time. The fight was fierce, with Bellatrix demonstrating not only her skill, but her total lack of hesitation when it came to killing. She was one of the few Death Eaters who openly reveled in the chaos and suffering caused by the Dark Lord's rise to power. Unlike the likes of Snape, whose motives were always veiled in ambiguity, or even Lucius Malfoy, who played his cards with a sense of elitism, Bellatrix's loyalty was naked, vicious, and unwavering. For Bellatrix, there was no higher calling than pleasing her master. Her ruthlessness was mirrored in her magical prowess, where Bellatrix was particularly skilled in the use of the Cruciatus Curse. A master of inflicting pain, she delighted in the screams of her victims. Her ability to cause such agony was not merely a testament to her magical prowess, but also a sign of her mindset. Bellatrix's magic was entirely pragmatic. It wasn't about researching or discovering new spells. Instead, it was about using existing dark magic to assert power and control. There was no theoretical framework to her magic. It was all about what worked in the moment. She was not seeking to unlock new truths about the world of magic. She was seeking to impose her will upon it. Bellatrix's relationship with Voldemort also sheds light on her practical approach to magic. While Voldemort was constantly obsessed with immortality and sought to manipulate the very essence of magic to further his ambitions, Bellatrix remained loyal to him with a singular, almost fanatical devotion. There is no evidence to suggest that Bellatrix, like Snape or even Voldemort himself, was interested in learning or creating new magical techniques. Instead, her loyalty was rooted in action and a desire for revenge against those who opposed her master. Her obsession with power and domination was not only reflected in her magical abilities, but also in the way she carried herself. She was a woman of action, someone who sought to impose her will through direct means. For example, when she was tasked with retrieving the prophecy in the Department of Mysteries, Bellatrix was not concerned with the deeper implications of what the prophecy could mean. She was only focused on the task at hand, even if it meant violence and chaos. She attacked without hesitation, slashing through obstacles and leaving destruction in her wake. Her role was not to question or theorize, but to execute. This was a stark contrast to someone like Severus Snape, who carefully weighed his actions and considered their ramifications before proceeding. Bellatrix, however, acted with a sense of urgency and passion, her magic aimed at achieving immediate results. When Bellatrix did speak of magic, her words were often full of dark conviction, but they lacked the depth of a true magical scholar. She had no particular interest in exploring the nuances of magic or in developing new spells. Her understanding was practical, often centered around what could be used to destroy or overpower. This is evident when Bellatrix is seen casting spells, her actions driven by passion and ferocity rather than deep knowledge. Unlike Snape, who had a profound understanding of potion-making, or Dumbledore, who studied the ancient and mysterious aspects of magic, Bellatrix had no desire to dive deeper into the essence of magic. Instead, she utilized what she knew to achieve a single goal: victory for Voldemort and the destruction of his enemies. In contrast, Severus Snape's magical research was groundbreaking. He was a talented wizard whose innovations included the invention of new potions, such as the powerful wolfsbane potion, which was used to keep werewolves under control. Snape was a master of occlumency and legilimency, developing techniques that allowed him to control his mind and read the minds of others. His deep understanding of magic extended to its most intricate and theoretical aspects. Similarly, Tom Riddle, before he became Lord Voldemort, was fascinated by the ancient, hidden aspects of magic. He sought out the secrets of immortality, creating Horcruxes and delving into the darkest realms of magic in an attempt to conquer death itself. These figures were consumed by the pursuit of knowledge and discovery. Bellatrix, on the other hand, was unconcerned with such academic pursuits. Her actions, while undoubtedly magical, were based on mastery of what was already known and what could be applied to furthering her own and Voldemort's power. She was a practitioner, not a researcher. Her understanding of magic was not intellectual, but visceral. Bellatrix did not seek to expand the boundaries of magic. She sought only to wield it with absolute dominance. This distinction between Bellatrix and other magical figures highlights a critical aspect of her character. Bellatrix's focus on the practical aspects of magic and her lack of interest in research or development reflect her personality. She was a warrior, a fighter, someone who believed in immediate results rather than theoretical advancements. Unlike other wizards who found joy in unraveling the mysteries of magic, Bellatrix found satisfaction in the destruction that magic could bring. Her talents were best used in battle, in the heart of conflict, where her formidable power could be unleashed without hesitation or doubt. In the end, Bellatrix Lestrange's magical legacy is not one of innovation or discovery. She did not change the face of magic or introduce new concepts to the wizarding world. Instead, she was a symbol of ruthless power, a person whose magic was driven by desire, not intellect. Her role in the Dark Lord's army was not to provide magical insight, but to act as a powerful instrument of destruction. Bellatrix's magic was not about deep understanding or breakthrough discoveries. It was about wielding the forces of darkness with deadly precision. This makes her one of the most feared figures in the wizarding world, but also one of the most misunderstood. For while others may have sought to expand the limits of magic, Bellatrix Lestrange was content to use it as a weapon in the service of her dark master. Number 25. Bellatrix was completely indifferent to the fate of other Death Eaters. In the dark corridors of Voldemort's inner circle, where every shadow hides secrets and every whispered name bears weight, Bellatrix Lestrange stood as one of the most feared and loyal of the Dark Lord's followers. Her allegiance to Voldemort was absolute, but it is a misconception to think that her life revolved solely around him, that she had no space for personal connections or complicated emotions. The truth, as with many things in the wizarding world, is far more complex than it might appear on the surface. Bellatrix's relationship with her fellow Death Eaters, as well as with her family, especially her sister Narcissa, tells a much richer story than one of cold, calculating devotion to Voldemort alone. Bellatrix's fierce loyalty to Voldemort often overshadowed her interactions with others, especially those who were also devoted to his cause. She was known to be merciless and ruthless, showing no hesitation in following her master's commands. However, this blind devotion did not mean that she was devoid of personal emotions or a sense of familial duty. This is particularly evident in her relationship with Narcissa Malfoy, her younger sister. Their connection was far from simple, and Bellatrix's feelings toward Narcissa shifted between contempt and a deep, almost desperate, sense of responsibility. At first glance, Bellatrix seemed to regard her sister with disdain. Narcissa was, in her eyes, a weaker, more pliable character, someone who, despite being a part of their pure-blooded family, was not as fully committed to Voldemort's vision. Bellatrix saw Narcissa's hesitations, her concern for her family's safety, as signs of weakness. Bellatrix had no such qualms. She had already thrown herself headfirst into the cause, willingly sacrificing any semblance of a normal life for the Dark Lord's ideals. Yet this apparent lack of emotional attachment to Narcissa was not all-encompassing. Despite her harsh criticisms, Bellatrix could not completely sever their familial bond. There were moments when Bellatrix showed subtle signs of respect for her sister's loyalty to her son, Draco Malfoy, and her desperation to protect him during the rise of Voldemort's power. It is in this delicate balance between disdain and respect that Bellatrix's character becomes more human and relatable. She was not incapable of seeing past the surface. While she might have looked down upon Narcissa's hesitation to fully embrace the darker aspects of Voldemort's ideology, Bellatrix never stopped caring about her sister, even if she did not always show it openly. This is particularly evident during the moments of crisis when Narcissa's love for her son became a deciding factor in the fate of others, including Bellatrix herself. When Narcissa, in the midst of the final battle, risked everything to save Draco, Bellatrix's reaction was not one of anger or dismissal. Instead, she seemed to understand her sister's actions on a deeper level, even though their paths had diverged dramatically over the years. The complexity of Bellatrix's emotions extended beyond her family, reaching into her interactions with other Death Eaters. While Bellatrix's primary loyalty was always to Voldemort, her feelings towards other followers of the Dark Lord were not always as clear-cut. She was fiercely protective of her position, often displaying a sense of superiority over her fellow Death Eaters, particularly those whom she deemed less competent or weaker than herself. For instance, she treated Severus Snape with contempt and suspicion despite his prominent role in Voldemort's inner circle. Their interactions were laced with tension, largely due to Snape's ambiguous loyalty and the secret he was keeping, his true allegiance to Dumbledore. Bellatrix, with her obsessive loyalty to Voldemort, could never forgive Snape for the secrets he kept, seeing his actions as a betrayal of their cause. However, not all of Bellatrix's relationships were founded on disdain or rivalry. Her dynamic with Rodolphus Lestrange, her husband, offers another fascinating glimpse into her character. Unlike her sister Narcissa, Bellatrix's marriage to Rodolphus was not one of convenience or duty, it was a genuine bond. Though their relationship was based on shared ideology and mutual respect for each other's strength, it was also rooted in love. Bellatrix's passion for her cause was matched only by the intensity of her feelings for Rodolphus. This connection shows a side of Bellatrix that is often overlooked, the capacity for genuine affection and attachment, even in the most volatile and dangerous of environments. She never hesitated to defend him, and in return, Rodolphus was one of the few people who could influence her actions when necessary. Yet, despite these emotional connections, Bellatrix remained a paradox. She was a woman who could form strong bonds with those closest to her, but she was also capable of unimaginable cruelty towards those who were not. In the end, it was her unwavering devotion to Voldemort that defined her, but that devotion did not erase her capacity for human connection. She was not a cold, emotionless figure, but rather a woman whose emotions were often tangled in a web of loyalty, family, and power. The ultimate contradiction of Bellatrix Lestrange's character is revealed in her actions during the final battle at Hogwarts. Despite her belief in Voldemort's victory, despite her willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way, Bellatrix's reaction to her own downfall was telling. In her final moments, as she was confronted by Molly Weasley, Bellatrix's arrogance crumbled and a flicker of doubt appeared in her eyes. She was not simply a mindless tool of Voldemort's will, she was a woman who had, at times, questioned her role in the larger scheme of things. The battle between Bellatrix and Molly Weasley, though brief, was a culmination of all the emotional complexity that Bellatrix had tried to suppress over the years. Bellatrix's tragic flaw was her inability to fully let go of her family, her past, and her personal connections. While she sought to push them aside in favor of her unwavering loyalty to Voldemort, they were never entirely gone. Even in her final moments, she remained a product of her past, the sister, the wife, and the daughter who could never completely sever the ties that bound her to her family. It was these ties that ultimately led to her downfall. In her quest for ultimate power and loyalty to Voldemort, Bellatrix failed to recognize the importance of those she loved, and in the end, it was this very failure that sealed her fate. Bellatrix's role as a Death Eater, her ruthless pursuit of Voldemort's goals, and her relationship with her family serve as a reminder that even the most seemingly cold and emotionless individuals are often driven by a complex web of motivations. Her love for her family, her loyalty to her master, and her desire for power were all interwoven in a way that made her one of the most fascinating characters in the wizarding world. She was neither a mindless follower nor a simple villain. Bellatrix Lestrange was a woman defined by the very contradictions she tried so hard to suppress. Number 26, Bellatrix was completely destroyed because of her loyalty. Bellatrix Lestrange's death in the final battle at Hogwarts remains one of the most poignant and tragic moments in the Harry Potter saga. However, many readers mistakenly attribute her undoing solely to her fierce loyalty to Lord Voldemort. While her unwavering devotion to the Dark Lord certainly played a role in her fate, there is far more at play in Bellatrix's demise than just blind servitude. The truth behind her destruction lies not only in her obsession with proving herself worthy of Voldemort's trust, but also in the inner conflicts and unresolved struggles that lingered within her throughout her life. She was not merely consumed by her loyalty. Instead, her loyalty was her own downfall, a tragic irony that only deepened the complexities of her character. Bellatrix's loyalty to Voldemort was unrivaled, but her relationship with him was not as straightforward as one might think. From her earliest involvement with the Death Eaters, she sought to gain the Dark Lord's approval, often going to extreme lengths to prove her commitment. She was perhaps the most fanatic of his followers, and this obsession with proving herself to him became the foundation of her identity. Her violent tendencies were not simply a result of her alignment with Voldemort, but rather a reflection of her own need to stand out and show her worth. Bellatrix, more than anyone else, desired to be seen as indispensable to Voldemort's cause, a fact that clouded her judgment and ultimately sealed her fate. Her devotion to Voldemort was evident in her relentless actions, from the torture of the Longbottoms to her participation in the Battle of Hogwarts. Yet her destruction was not simply the result of her allegiance to him, but rather the culmination of years of her internal struggles. Bellatrix was never quite as assured in her role within Voldemort's world as one might expect. She wrestled with her own doubts, though she concealed them behind layers of cruelty and venom. Her need for Voldemort's validation became so consuming that she could no longer discern where her loyalty to him ended and her own identity began. Her fierce love for the Dark Lord was undoubtedly genuine, but it was also suffused with deep insecurity and the fear of being overlooked or cast aside. This drove her to extreme measures, pushing her into a corner where she believed that her very survival depended on proving her worth through increasingly brutal actions. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Bellatrix reveals the depth of her obsession with Voldemort. When discussing her niece, Nymphadora Tonks, she expresses a deep-seated need to surpass others in the Dark Lord's eyes. Bellatrix is not only willing to eliminate those who stand in her way, but she also craves to be seen as the Dark Lord's most loyal and devoted servant, a title that she could never let go of. Yet despite her violent actions, Bellatrix's deepest fear was never truly physical harm. It was the idea of being cast aside by Voldemort. This fear clouded her actions and decisions, making her more susceptible to the very forces that she thought she could control. She would destroy anyone who threatened her sense of significance in Voldemort's world, but she would also destroy herself in the process. Bellatrix's death, while tragic, was not solely a punishment for her blind loyalty. It was also the end of her internal struggle, a struggle that had raged within her for years. She did not die in an act of martyrdom for Voldemort, but rather in a final attempt to prove herself, to show the world and herself that her devotion had not been in vain. As she stood in the midst of the final battle, her actions seemed to be fueled by the need to secure her place in history. Bellatrix had long since abandoned any notion of self-preservation. Her desire was to leave behind a legacy to be remembered as the one who fought fiercely for the Dark Lord, regardless of the outcome. Her tragic end was, in many ways, a self-inflicted wound, an attempt to regain control over the one thing that had always eluded her, her place in Voldemort's world. Throughout the Battle of Hogwarts, Bellatrix displayed a cold fury that contrasted sharply with her earlier, more calculated cruelty. In her final moments, there was a palpable desperation to her actions. She was no longer the confident and menacing figure she had been at the height of her power. Instead, she was a woman consumed by fear, fear of losing her significance, fear of failure, and ultimately a fear of death. Bellatrix had spent her entire life building herself up as Voldemort's greatest follower, and when she was faced with the reality of his downfall, she became utterly unmoored. The battle was not just against the forces of good, it was a battle for her place in Voldemort's twisted hierarchy, a struggle to prove that she too could be remembered. Her death at the hands of Molly Weasley was not just the result of Molly's righteous anger. It was a culmination of Bellatrix's own choices, a tragic, final chapter in a life that had been defined by her obsession with power and validation. When she was struck down, Bellatrix did not go quietly. She fought until the very end, believing in her heart that her death would somehow serve as proof of her loyalty. It was not the act of a martyr, but the act of a woman desperate to leave a mark on the world, to ensure that her life had meant something more than just servitude. Bellatrix's final moments speak volumes about the internal conflicts that had plagued her for years. Throughout her life, she had believed that her devotion to Voldemort would elevate her, that it would define her as a person of importance. In the end, her faith in that belief was all-consuming. Her death, then, was not just the tragic conclusion to her life of violence and cruelty, it was the end of her inner struggle, the moment when she realized that all her devotion and sacrifice had led to nothing more than her own destruction. Bellatrix's death can be viewed as a form of self-punishment, a final, futile attempt to regain her former status. In the end, she was not destroyed solely by her loyalty, but by her inability to understand that true power does not lie in servitude, but in the ability to break free from it. She was a woman who had been so devoted to proving herself worthy that she lost sight of her own worth. This realization, however, came too late. Her life had been spent in the pursuit of approval, and in the end, that very pursuit led to her undoing. Her death, tragic and dramatic as it was, symbolizes the dangers of unchecked devotion and the self-destructive nature of a life spent in pursuit of someone else's approval. Bellatrix Lestrange was not simply the victim of Voldemort's power, she was the victim of her own obsessive need to belong. Her downfall was a testament to the fragility of the human psyche and how even the most intense loyalty can become a cage that traps its own wielder. Bellatrix's tragic end, therefore, was not just the result of her allegiance to Voldemort, but the inevitable consequence of her inability to find her own sense of purpose outside of his shadow. As one of the most complex characters in the Harry Potter series, Bellatrix's life and death serve as a reminder that loyalty, when taken to its extreme, can destroy not just the object of that loyalty, but the person who possesses it. She died as she had lived, a woman desperate to prove herself, but in the end, it was not her loyalty to Voldemort that destroyed her. It was her own inability to break free from the chains of that loyalty. Number 27, Bellatrix saw Voldemort as the ultimate ideal. Bellatrix Lestrange is a character who has often been misunderstood, particularly when it comes to her relationship with Lord Voldemort. Many believe that her unwavering loyalty to him was born out of blind admiration for his ideals, that she saw him as the embodiment of a perfect leader, an absolute ideal of power and moral truth. However, this view of Bellatrix overlooks the complexity of her devotion and the reasons behind her loyalty. For Bellatrix, Voldemort was not an infallible moral guide or a symbol of ultimate justice. Instead, she saw him as a symbol of power, a figure who offered her the status, recognition, and authority she craved. Her allegiance was not rooted in a belief in his philosophical doctrines, but in the opportunities he provided for personal advancement. Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort began long before she became a member of his inner circle. As a young woman, she was drawn to the idea of power and prestige, a desire that was magnified by her upbringing in the noble, aristocratic Lestrange family. In her youth, Bellatrix was taught to value blood purity above all else, and she looked to Voldemort as a leader who promised to restore the wizarding world to what she believed was its rightful order. For Bellatrix, the Dark Lord was not just a figure of dark power, but a path to achieving her own ambitions. She wasn't interested in his rhetoric about purity and supremacy, because to her these ideas were simply means to an end. She didn't follow Voldemort because she believed in his cause. She followed him because he was the leader who could give her the power she wanted. This understanding of Bellatrix's motivations is crucial to understanding her character, especially in contrast to other Death Eaters. Take, for instance, Severus Snape. Snape's loyalty to Voldemort, though deeply rooted in his own twisted beliefs and past trauma, was intertwined with a sense of duty and honor, even if misdirected. His dedication to Voldemort came from a belief in the Dark Lord's ultimate vision, even if that vision was flawed. Bellatrix, on the other hand, was less about ideology and more about the sheer promise of strength and control. This difference in motivations becomes even more evident when considering Bellatrix's behavior when Voldemort's fortunes faltered. For Bellatrix, Voldemort represented a raw, untamed power that could take her to the top. She believed in him because he could offer her more than anyone else ever could. Unlike others in his inner circle who may have been swayed by moral convictions or long-term ideological goals, Bellatrix was more focused on the tangible rewards. She never questioned his methods or his views. Instead, she saw him as a master who could give her what she desired. She was, in essence, his most loyal follower, not because she believed in his cause, but because she believed in what following him could bring her. This is perhaps best seen in her violent defense of Voldemort when he was at his lowest after his fall from power in the early 1980s. While many of his followers scattered or hesitated, Bellatrix never wavered in her belief that he would rise again, for she believed that in his resurgence lay her own chance at power and prestige. Bellatrix's actions during her time in Azkaban further reinforced this idea. Although she was imprisoned for her crimes, she never lost faith in Voldemort. To her, Azkaban was merely a temporary setback. While many others might have broken under the oppressive force of the Dementors, Bellatrix clung to the belief that Voldemort would return and that he would reward her loyalty. For her, his return was not a matter of moral necessity or a desire to undo the wrongs of the wizarding world. It was a promise that he would restore her to her rightful place of power. It is telling that upon her release, she was eager to rejoin his side, not out of a deep conviction in his cause, but because she knew that in following him she could regain everything she had lost. Her devotion to Voldemort was also linked to her obsession with blood purity, a value she shared with many in the Death Eater ranks. However, it is important to note that her obsession was not driven by an intrinsic belief in the superiority of pure bloods over Muggle-borns. Rather, it was a means to an end. For Bellatrix, blood purity was a tool, a way to elevate herself and her family to greater heights in the wizarding world. She used the idea of blood purity as a means to justify her violent actions, but at its core, it was not a moral principle for her. It was a belief that fit neatly with her desire for power and status, an ideology that allowed her to see herself as part of an exclusive group that could dominate the wizarding world. One of the most telling moments in Bellatrix's journey is her relationship with her family. Her marriage to Rodolphus Lestrange, a fellow Death Eater, was a strategic alliance rather than a romantic one. Bellatrix, like many in the upper echelons of society, saw marriage as a political tool. It was a way to strengthen her position and increase her influence, but it did not serve to fulfill her deeper emotional needs. Bellatrix's true loyalty lay not with her husband or family, but with Voldemort. She was willing to abandon her own family for the sake of her devotion to him, revealing just how deeply her desire for power and recognition had taken hold of her. Bellatrix's relationship with Voldemort was also marked by an almost fanatical admiration. However, this admiration was not for his ideals, but for the position he held. She admired him not because of his vision for the wizarding world, but because he was the personification of the very power she sought. She revered him as a leader who could give her what she wanted: control, recognition, and the opportunity to shape the wizarding world according to her vision. Her relationship with him was transactional, based on her need to prove herself and to be rewarded for her loyalty. This is reflected in the way she reacted to Voldemort's various gestures of favor. When he showed her approval, it was not a sign of his belief in her abilities or her worth. Rather, it was a confirmation that she was on the right path, that her devotion was paying off. As the final battles in the wizarding world raged on, Bellatrix's desperation for approval became more apparent. In the Battle of Hogwarts, she fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. It was not because she believed in the cause, but because she was desperate to prove her worth to Voldemort. Her desire to please him led her to act recklessly, to pursue power and dominance without concern for the consequences. In the end, Bellatrix's death was a tragic consequence of her inability to see beyond her own obsession with power and recognition. She died not as a martyr for Voldemort's cause, but as a tragic figure consumed by her own desires. Bellatrix's unwavering loyalty to Voldemort can be understood not as a blind adherence to his ideals, but as a reflection of her need for power and validation. She followed him not because she believed in his cause, but because she believed he was the key to achieving her personal goals. Her story is one of ambition, obsession, and the dangerous consequences of seeking power without a moral compass. Bellatrix Lestrange, for all her loyalty to the Dark Lord, was not a believer in his vision for the wizarding world. She was a follower because she saw him as a means to an end, a leader who could give her what she craved most: power and recognition.